I never thought I'd find myself starting over at 35. But here I was, pulling up to my new home in Springfield, Massachusetts. The quaint two-story house on Maple Street looked promising, a fresh start after my messy divorce. As I lugged boxes from the U-Haul, the crisp October air filled my lungs. Leaves crunched under my feet, a symphony of reds and golds carpeting the lawn. My new job at the local hospital was set to start next week, giving me time to settle in. I'd chosen Springfield for its balance of urban amenities and small-town charm. Plus, it was far enough from Boston to avoid bumping into my ex and our old crowd. As I fumbled with my keys, struggling with a particularly heavy box, a voice called out, "Need a hand, neighbor?" I turned to see a man in his early 40s walking over from the house next door. He had a friendly smile and an outstretched hand. "I'm Tom," he said. "Welcome to the neighborhood." I introduced myself, grateful for the help. As we carried boxes inside, Tom filled me in on local hot spots, the best coffee at Shelburne Falls Coffee Roasters, weekend farmers markets at Forest Park. It felt good to make a connection so quickly. Maybe this new chapter wouldn't be so lonely after all. Over the next few weeks, Tom proved to be a godsend. He'd pop over with homemade lasagna when I was too tired to cook after long shifts at the hospital. He'd offer to mow my lawn when he did his, saying it was no trouble at all. We'd chat over the fence about our days, and he'd always have a funny story about the eccentric characters in our neighborhood. One Saturday, Tom invited me to join him and some friends for a Patriots game at Nathan Bill's bar and restaurant. The place was packed, buzzing with excitement. As we cheered on the team, I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't experienced in years. Tom introduced me to his circle, other neighbors, co-workers from his IT job, old college buddies. They were warm and welcoming, peppering me with questions about my move and my work. Tom beamed proudly, as if showing off a prized possession. As weeks turned to months, Tom's friendship became a constant in my new life. He seemed to always be around when I needed help, changing a stubborn light bulb, jump-starting my car on a frosty morning, or just lending an ear after a tough day at work. I was grateful for his kindness, but a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered that it all seemed too good to be true. I brushed it off, chalking it up to my post-divorce cynicism. Surely, I deserved some good luck after everything I'd been through. The first gift appeared on my doorstep one crisp November morning, a beautiful potted orchid with no card. I assumed it was from Tom, a thoughtful gesture to brighten my day. But when I thanked him, he looked puzzled, insisting it wasn't from him. A week later, I found a box of my favorite chocolates, a brand I'd only mentioned once in passing. Again, no card. This time, I didn't mention it to Tom. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The gifts kept coming, a scarf in my favorite color, a rare vinyl record I'd been hunting for years, a vintage medical textbook I'd admired in a shop window downtown. Each item was eerily perfect, as if chosen by someone who knew me intimately. I started to feel uneasy. Who was sending these things? How did they know so much about me? I considered reporting it to the police, but what would I say? Someone's sending me nice gifts? It sounded ridiculous. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed a small package on my nightstand. My blood ran cold. I always locked my doors. Inside was a delicate silver necklace, with a heart-shaped locket. When I opened it, I found a tiny photo of myself, laughing at something off camera. I didn't remember this picture being taken. That night, I double-checked every lock, but sleep eluded me. The gifts that once seemed charming now felt like a threat. Someone was watching me, learning about me, and now they had been inside my home. The safe haven it built in Springfield suddenly felt like a trap. The first call came at 2:37 a.m., jolting me from a fitful sleep. I fumbled for my phone, my heart racing. "Hello?" I mumbled, but there was only silence on the other end. Then, just before I hung up, I heard it. Soft, rhythmic breathing. I tried to shake it off as a wrong number, but the calls kept coming. Always late at night, always from a blocked number. Sometimes there was just breathing. Other times, I'd hear muffled background noises, traffic, wind, what sounded like footsteps on gravel. During one call, I heard a whisper so faint I almost missed it. "I see you." I slammed the phone down, my hands shaking. I peered out the window, scanning the dark street, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. I changed my number, thinking that would solve the problem. For a few blissful nights, the calls stopped. But then my work phone started ringing in the middle of the night. How had they found my new number? I mentioned the calls to Tom over coffee one morning. He looked concerned, suggesting I contact the police. But something in his eyes made me hesitate. Was it worry for my safety, or something else? That night, as I lay awake listening for the now familiar ring, I realized the calls weren't just disrupting my sleep. They were eroding my sense of security. Every shadow, every creak of the house sent my imagination into overdrive. Who was on the other end of the line? And what did they want from me? It started with fleeting glimpses, a shadow moving in my peripheral vision, gone when I turned to look. I chalked it up to stress and lack of sleep from the ongoing phone calls. But as the days wore on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. One evening, as I was washing dishes, I saw a figure in my backyard through the kitchen window. My heart leapt into my throat. I blinked, and it was gone. Was I losing my mind? I started keeping the curtains drawn, but that only made me feel more trapped. I'd jump at every sound, convinced someone was just outside, peering in. The worst was at night. I'd lie in bed, staring at the shadows on my ceiling, certain they were moving, shifting into sinister shapes. One particularly bad night, I could have sworn I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my bedroom. I held my breath, frozen in fear, as the doorknob slowly turned. But the door never opened, and eventually the sun rose, chasing away the terrors of the night. I tried to rationalize it. Old houses make noises, trees cast strange shadows. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The safe haven it found in Springfield was slowly becoming a waking nightmare. I considered confiding in Tom, but lately, his constant presence was starting to feel less comforting and more concerning. Was I just being paranoid, or was there a reason he always seemed to be around? It happened on a Friday night. I'd just gotten home from a grueling shift at the hospital, exhausted and looking forward to a quiet evening. As I turned the key in the lock, I noticed something off. The door was already unlocked. My heart pounding, I pushed it open slowly. The house was dark, silent, but something felt wrong. I fumbled for the light switch, and as the room illuminated, my breath caught in my throat. My living room was a disaster. Drawers pulled out, contents strewn across the floor, picture frames smashed, my clothes scattered everywhere. But it wasn't a typical burglary. Nothing valuable seemed to be missing. With shaking hands, I called the police. As I waited, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On my coffee table, perfectly centered, was a framed photo of me. It wasn't one I owned. It showed me at the supermarket earlier that week, unaware I was being photographed. The police arrived, asked questions, took photos. They were sympathetic, but not particularly hopeful. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints. They suggested changing my locks and installing a security system. As they left, I caught a glimpse of Tom watching from his porch. He waved, called out, asking if everything was okay. I managed a weak smile and nod, but something in his expression made me uneasy. Was that concern in his eyes or something else? That night, I stayed at a hotel, unable to face sleeping in my violated home. As I lay awake, jumping at every sound, one thought kept circling in my mind. The intruder hadn't broken in to take something. They had broken in to leave something behind. The next morning, I steeled myself and went to the police station. Officer Martinez, a kind-faced woman in her 40s, listened patiently as I poured out my story. The gifts, the phone calls, the shadows, and finally, the break-in. "Why didn't you report this earlier?" she asked, her brow furrowed with concern. I felt foolish as I explained how I doubted myself, how each incident seemed explainable on its own. She nodded understandingly. Officer Martinez took detailed notes, asking questions about my routine, my relationships, anyone who might hold a grudge. When I mentioned Tom's constant presence, she perked up. "We'll look into him," she assured me. As I left the station, I felt a mix of relief and anxiety. On one hand, it was comforting to have professionals involved. On the other, making an official report made everything feel more real, more terrifying. Over the next few days, I saw police cars patrolling my street more frequently. Officer Martinez called with updates. They'd interviewed Tom. He'd seemed surprised and concerned, she said. Checked local CCTV footage and were monitoring my phone records. But as the days turned into weeks with no new leads, I could sense their interest waning. Sometimes these things just stop on their own, Officer Martinez said gently during one of our check-ins. I nodded, but inside, I was screaming. This didn't feel like something that would just stop. I was grateful for the police involvement, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still alone in this nightmare. The stalker was out there, watching, waiting, and I had no idea what they would do next. As the weeks passed without incident, I slowly began to relax. The police presence in the neighborhood gradually decreased, and life seemed to be returning to normal. I started sleeping through the night again, leaving my curtains open during the day, and even ventured out for evening walks in the crisp New England air. Tom remained a constant presence, always ready with a kind word or an offer to help. I felt guilty for having suspected him, especially after Officer Martinez confirmed his alibi for the night of the break-in. He seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being, often checking in to make sure I was okay. One Saturday, Tom invited me to a neighborhood barbecue at his place. The afternoon was filled with laughter, good food, and friendly faces. As I sat on Tom's porch, sipping a cold beer and chatting with neighbors, I felt a warmth I hadn't experienced in months. Maybe, just maybe, the worst was behind me. I even started dating again, meeting a charming doctor named Michael through a work colleague. Our first date at a cozy Italian restaurant in downtown Springfield was lovely, full of easy conversation and shared laughter. As autumn faded into winter, I threw myself into holiday preparations. I decorated my house with twinkling lights and evergreen boughs, determined to reclaim my space and my life. I even planned a small Christmas party for my coworkers, excited to fill my home with friendly faces and joyful noise. But even as I embraced this new normalcy, a tiny voice in the back of my mind whispered caution. Was this truly the end, or just the calm before another storm? The Christmas party was in full swing. Laughter and the sounds of clinking glasses filled my living room as my coworkers mingled, admiring the decorations. I was in the kitchen, refilling a platter of hors d'oeuvres, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My stomach dropped as I opened the message. It was a photo, clearly taken through my living room window just moments ago. In it, I could see myself in the kitchen, unaware I was being watched. The text below read, "You look beautiful tonight. Red is my favorite color on you." I froze, the platter slipping from my hands and clattering to the floor. The chatter in the living room stopped abruptly. As my coworkers rushed to see what had happened, I struggled to compose myself, muttering something about Butterfingers, but my mind was racing. The stalker was here, right outside my house. I scanned the room, noting that Tom hadn't arrived yet. Was it him, or was I jumping to conclusions again? I excused myself and locked myself in the bathroom, hands shaking as I called Officer Martinez. She promised to send a patrol car immediately, but advised me not to alarm my guests. As I rejoined the party, plastering on a fake smile, I felt like I was in a waking nightmare. Every laugh seemed too loud, every shadow too dark. I found myself constantly glancing at the windows, searching for any sign of movement outside. The festive atmosphere now felt suffocating. My safe haven had been violated once again, and this time it had happened right under my nose. As my guests continued to celebrate, oblivious to my inner turmoil, one thought kept circling in my mind. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just beginning. The days following the Christmas party were a blur of fear and paranoia. The police increased their patrols again, but it did little to ease my anxiety. I installed a state-of-the-art security system, complete with cameras and motion sensors, but even that felt insufficient. The texts kept coming, each more unsettling than the last. "I love watching you sleep," one read, accompanied by a photo of me in bed, clearly taken through my bedroom window. Another said, "We'd make beautiful children together," with an image of me shopping for groceries at the local Whole Foods. I stopped going out unless absolutely necessary, working from home whenever possible. When I did venture out, I constantly looked over my shoulder, scrutinizing every face in the crowd. Was that him? Did he just duck behind that car? Tom noticed my withdrawal and became even more attentive. He'd bring over meals, offer to run errands for me, anything to help, but his constant presence was starting to feel suffocating. I found myself making excuses to avoid him, unable to shake the nagging suspicion that he might be involved. One night, I woke to the sound of my car alarm blaring. Heart pounding, I looked out the window to see my car's tires slashed, the word "mine" scratched into the hood. The police came, took photos, dusted for prints, but found nothing conclusive. As I stood in my driveway, watching the tow truck take away my vandalized car, I felt a presence behind me. I turned to see Tom, concern etched on his face. "I heard the commotion," he said. "Are you okay?" I nodded numbly, but inside I was screaming. This had to end. Somehow, some way, I had to take control of the situation. But how do you fight an enemy you can't see? It was a quiet Tuesday evening when everything came to a head. I was in my living room, absently flipping through channels, when I heard a noise from the kitchen. My heart raced as I slowly made my way there, phone in hand, 911 pre-dialed. As I rounded the corner, I saw him, a hooded figure, his back to me, rummaging through my drawers. Time seemed to stand still as I took in the scene, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Then, almost in slow motion, he turned. Our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of recognition that knocked the breath from my lungs. It wasn't Tom. It wasn't anyone I knew from Springfield. It was my ex-husband, David. "What are you doing here?" I managed to choke out, my finger hovering over the call button. His face twisted into a sneer. "Checking up on you, darling. Making sure you're not forgetting about me." He took a step towards me, and I instinctively backed away. "You've been stalking me all this time?" The pieces were falling into place. The gifts, the calls, the photos. He'd always been possessive, but this was beyond anything I could have imagined. "You're mine," he growled, lunging for me. I ducked, my survival instincts kicking in. I ran for the front door, but he was faster, grabbing my arm and spinning me around. As we grappled, I heard a shout from outside. "Hey, what's going on in there?" It was Tom's voice, followed by urgent knocking on the front door. David's grip loosened for a split second, surprise flashing across his face. I seized the moment, wrenching free and bolting for the door. I flung it open, nearly colliding with Tom on the porch. "He's here," I gasped, pointing back into the house. Tom's eyes widened as he took in my disheveled appearance and the fear in my eyes. Without hesitation, he pushed past me into the house, phone already in hand, dialing 911. I heard sounds of a scuffle inside as I stood frozen on the porch, torn between fleeing and going back to help Tom. Moments later, red and blue lights flooded the street as police cars screeched to a halt in front of my house. Everything after that was a blur of activity. Officers rushing in, David being led out in handcuffs, paramedics checking me for injuries. Through it all, Tom stayed by my side, a steady presence in the chaos. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had just happened hit me. My ex-husband, the man I had once loved and trusted, had been terrorizing me for months. The sense of violation was overwhelming, but mixed with it was a strange sense of relief. The nightmare was over. The monster had a face. The days following the confrontation were a whirlwind of police statements, court appearances, and sleepless nights. David was held without bail, charged with stalking, breaking and entering, and attempted assault. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The gifts, the photos, even DNA from the break-in matched him. As I sat in the courtroom, listening to the prosecutor lay out the case, I felt a mix of emotions: anger, fear, but also a growing sense of empowerment. I was no longer a victim hiding in the shadows. I was a survivor, facing my tormentor head on. Tom was there every step of the way, offering support and sometimes just a comforting presence. I found myself leaning on him more and more, grateful for his unwavering friendship. The suspicion I had felt towards him earlier now seemed like a distant memory. One evening, as we sat on my porch drinking coffee, Tom turned to me with a serious expression. "You know," he said, "I've been thinking. Maybe it's time for a fresh start. Somewhere new, where these memories can't follow you." I was taken aback at first, but as I mulled over his words, I realized he might be right. Springfield, once my haven, now felt tainted by the ordeal it'd been through. Every corner held a memory of fear, every shadow a potential threat. That night, I couldn't sleep, my mind racing with possibilities. Where would I go? What would I do? The idea of starting over again was daunting, but also exciting. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope for the future. As I watched the sun rise, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, I made my decision. It was time for a new chapter, a true fresh start. The nightmare was over, and I had survived. Now, it was time to live again. 2 months after the confrontation, I found myself in a small coastal town in Oregon, over 3,000 miles from Springfield. The salty air and the constant rhythm of the waves were a balm to my frayed nerves. I'd found a job at the local clinic, rented a cozy beachfront cottage, and was slowly rebuilding my life. Tom had been supportive of my decision to move, even helping me pack and driving me to the airport. We promised to stay in touch, and his occasional texts and calls were a comforting reminder of the friendship we'd forged through adversity. As winter gave way to spring, I felt myself starting to relax, to breathe easier. I made new friends, joined a local yoga class, even started dating again. A kind-hearted marine biologist named Jack, who took me tide pooling on our second date. But one rainy afternoon in April, everything changed. I was walking home from the clinic, umbrella in hand, when I saw a familiar figure across the street. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. David was in prison, wasn't he? The man turned, and for a split second, our eyes met. It was him. Before I could react, he disappeared into the crowd. I stood there, rain soaking through my clothes, unable to move. How had he found me? How was he here? With shaking hands, I called Officer Martinez back in Springfield. Her voice was grim as she confirmed my worst fears. David had been released on a technicality. A clerical error had rendered key evidence inadmissible, and without it, they couldn't hold him. As I hung up, a chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with my wet clothes. The nightmare I thought I'd escaped had followed me across the country. The hunt had begun again, and this time, I was determined to end it, one way or another. The next few days were a blur of panic and preparation. I alerted the local police, installed new security measures, and tried to go about my life as normally as possible. But every shadow made me jump. Every unfamiliar face on the street sent my heart racing. I debated calling Tom, but something held me back. This was my fight now, and I needed to face it on my own. Plus, a small part of me worried about drawing anyone else into this nightmare. It was a week later when it happened. I was closing up the clinic late one night, the last one to leave as usual. As I locked the front door, I felt a presence behind me. I turned slowly, already knowing what I would see. David stood there, a twisted smile on his face. "Miss me, darling?" he sneered. I didn't run. I didn't scream. Something inside me had snapped, and all the fear and anger of the past months came rushing to the surface. "What do you want, David?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. He took a step closer. "You know what I want. You, us, together again?" I laughed, a harsh sound that surprised even me. "There is no us, David. There never will be again." His face contorted with rage. He lunged forward, grabbing my arm. But this time, I was ready. The self-defense classes I'd been taking paid off as I twisted out of his grip, my knee coming up to connect with his groin. As he doubled over in pain, I ran. Not away, but towards the police station 2 blocks down. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps and ragged breathing spurring me on. I burst through the station doors, gasping out my story to the startled officer at the desk. Within minutes, patrol cars were racing out, and shortly after, they returned with David in custody. As I watched him being led away in handcuffs, our eyes met one last time. In that moment, I saw something I'd never seen before. Fear. Not of the police or the consequences, but of me. He finally understood that he no longer had power over me. I had faced my nightmare head on, and I had won. In the weeks following David's arrest, I found myself in a strange limbo. On one hand, there was relief. He was back in custody, this time with no chance of a technicality saving him. The evidence was irrefutable, and he was facing serious jail time. But on the other hand, the fear lingered. I jumped at unexpected noises, double-checked locks obsessively, and struggled to sleep through the night. The rational part of my brain knew I was safe, but my body remained on high alert, conditioned by months of terror. I threw myself into therapy, determined to reclaim my life. Slowly, painfully, I began to process the trauma. I learned coping mechanisms, worked through my anger and fear, and started to rebuild my sense of security. To my surprise, Tom flew out to visit, bringing with him a care package from my old neighbors in Springfield. His familiar face and unwavering support were like a lifeline, reminding me that there was still good in the world. As summer turned to fall, I made a decision. I wouldn't let David's actions dictate my life any longer. I loved my new home in Oregon, but I also missed the life I'd started to build in Springfield. It was time to take back what was mine. With Tom's help, I moved back to my old house on Maple Street. The neighborhood welcomed me with open arms, and for the first time in over a year, I felt truly at home. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was hauling boxes into my new apartment in Boston's Back Bay neighborhood. After my messy divorce back in Chicago, this job offer from a tech startup near Kendall Square felt like a lifeline. The crisp September air carried a hint of fall, and the leaves on the commons were just starting to turn. As I struggled with a particularly heavy box, a voice called out, "Need a hand with that?" I turned to see a guy about my age, all Red Sox cap and friendly grin. "I am Mike from 4B," he said, already reaching for the box. We chatted as we worked, and I found myself relaxing for the first time in months. Mike filled me in on the best coffee shops, warned me about the crazy parking rules, and insisted I join him for the Patriots game on Sunday. That night, as I sat surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe Boston would be the fresh start I needed. I pulled out my phone to text my sister back in Illinois, letting her know I'd arrived safely. As I typed, a notification popped up, a friend request from Mike. I hesitated for a moment, then hit accept. What could go wrong with making a new friend? Over the next few weeks, Mike became a constant presence in my life. He was always around to help with little tasks, changing a light bulb, recommending a good sandwich shop, or just providing company when the loneliness of being in a new city hit hard. We'd grab beers at the Poorhouse on Boylston, or catch a Sox game at Fenway. It felt good to have a friend, but something started to feel off. I'd mentioned casually that I was thinking of trying out a new restaurant, and Mike would show up there, claiming he'd been craving Italian food too. He seemed to know my schedule better than I did, always appearing in the lobby just as I was leaving for work or coming home. One Saturday morning, I decided to go for a run along the Charles River Esplanade. As I rounded a bend, I nearly collided with a jogger coming the other way. It was Mike, of course. "Great minds think alike," he laughed, falling into step beside me. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than coincidence. That night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. A text from Mike. "Sleep well, neighbor. See you in the morning." I stared at the message, a chill running down my spine. I hadn't told him my plans for tomorrow. How did he know? Monday morning, I threw myself into work, grateful for the distraction. Our office was in one of those sleek, modern buildings with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Charles River. As I waited for the elevator, I caught a glimpse of a familiar Red Sox cap in the reflection of the polished doors. I whirled around, but the lobby was empty. Throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. During a meeting, I glanced out the window and swore I saw Mike standing across the street, staring up at our floor. By the time I blinked and looked again, he was gone. At lunch, I decided to clear my head with a walk to Tat Bakery. As I waited in line, my phone buzzed. A text from Mike. "Try the avocado toast. It's amazing." My blood ran cold. How did he know where I was? Back at the office, I tried to focus on my work, but my hands were shaking. As I was packing up to leave, my coworker Jen stopped by my desk. "Hey, there's some guy downstairs asking for you. Says he's your neighbor." The elevator ride down felt like a descent into a nightmare, but when I reached the lobby, there was no sign of Mike, just an origami flower on the security desk with my name on it. That night, I triple-checked the locks on my apartment door. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As I moved through my evening routine, little things seemed out of place. A coffee mug I didn't remember using, a window I could have sworn I'd closed, My favorite sweater, which I thought was in the laundry, folded neatly on my bed. I tried to convince myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of the new job and city was getting to me. But then I noticed my laptop was open, the screen glowing softly. I always shut it down before leaving for work. Heart pounding, I checked my browser history. Someone had been on my social media accounts, scrolling through years of photos and posts. A noise in the hallway made me jump. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see Mike's grinning face. The hall was empty, but a piece of paper had been slipped under my door. With trembling hands, I unfolded it. Inside was a crude drawing of my apartment layout, with an X marked over my bedroom. I spent the night huddled on the couch, lights blazing, clutching my phone like a lifeline. Every creak and groan of the old building sent my heart racing. When dawn finally broke, I hadn't slept a wink. The next morning, bleary-eyed and on edge, I almost tripped over a package outside my door. It was a plain brown box. No return address. Just my name scrawled in familiar handwriting. Mike's handwriting. I stared at it, my stomach churning. Part of me wanted to throw it away unopened, but curiosity won out. Inside was a framed photo of me, but not a recent one. This was from years ago, back in Chicago. I recognized the backdrop, Millennium Park, the bean sculpture gleaming behind me. I was smiling, carefree, my arm around someone, but their face had been scratched out, leaving just a ragged hole in the photo. Underneath the frame was a note. "I've been waiting so long to find you again. We belong together." The words swam before my eyes as panic set in. This wasn't just some overly friendly neighbor. This was something much darker, much more dangerous. With shaking hands, I called the police. Officer Ramirez arrived quickly, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to my frayed nerves. She examined the package, took my statement, and promised to increase patrols in the area. But her words as she left chilled me to the bone. Lock your doors and be careful who you trust. The next few days passed in a blur of fear and sleepless nights. I jumped at every sound, flinched at every shadow. The police had nothing concrete to go on. No fingerprints on the package. No clear evidence of a break-in. Officer Ramirez suggested I stay with a friend, but I had no one in Boston. I was alone. At work, I could barely focus. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart raced, expecting another message from Mike. But there was nothing. The silence was almost worse than the constant contact had been. What was he planning? I started taking different routes to and from work, varying my schedule, always looking over my shoulder. I ordered groceries for delivery, too scared to venture out to the store. My coworkers noticed the change in me, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I flinched when someone approached my desk unexpectedly. Jen tried to get me to open up, but how could I explain the living nightmare I'd found myself in? One night, as I huddled on my couch, I heard a scratching at my door. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing. But when I reluctantly opened the door, I found a single red rose, and tied to its stem was a key, a copy of my apartment key. The rose and key were the last straw. I called Officer Ramirez again, my voice shaking as I explained. She arrived with a forensics team, dusting for prints and taking photos. But Mike, if it was indeed Mike, had been careful. There was no physical evidence linking him to the gifts or the apparent break-ins. As the police worked, I wandered my apartment, really looking at it for the first time in days. And that's when I started noticing things. Little things. Things that would be easy to overlook if you weren't paranoid and scared out of your mind. A photo frame slightly askew. Books on my shelf rearranged. And then I saw it. A blinking red light coming from behind my TV. My blood ran cold as Officer Ramirez confirmed my fears. A hidden camera. As they swept the apartment, they found more. In the bathroom, in my bedroom, even in the hallway outside. I felt violated, exposed, like my skin was crawling with unseen eyes. The police took the cameras as evidence, but the damage was done. My safe haven, my home, had been turned into a prison of fear. As Officer Ramirez left, she hesitated. "We'll do everything we can," she said, "but you might want to consider moving. Sometimes that's the only way to shake a stalker." I couldn't sleep that night. Couldn't even close my eyes without imagining hidden cameras, unseen watchers. By dawn, I'd made up my mind. I was done being a victim. It was time to confront Mike. I waited in the lobby of our building, my whole body tense. When Mike strolled in, all casual smiles and friendly waves, something in me snapped. I lunged at him, grabbing his shirt. "What the hell is wrong with you?" I shouted, months of fear and anger pouring out. The gifts, the cameras, the stalking, I know it's you. Mike's face went from shocked to confused to amused. He gently pried my hands off his shirt. "Whoa, buddy. I think you've got the wrong idea here," he said, his voice maddeningly calm. "I've been in New York for the past 2 weeks, visiting my sister. Just got back last night. What cameras are you talking about?" I stood there, speechless, as Mike pulled out his phone and showed me pictures, time-stamped and geotagged, of him in front of the Statue of Liberty in Times Square at a Yankees game. "I think you need help, man," he said, backing away slowly. "Maybe lay off the late-night horror movies, yeah?" As Mike hurried away, I slumped against the wall, my mind reeling. If it wasn't Mike, then who? The days following my confrontation with Mike were filled with a strange mix of relief and lingering unease. I apologized profusely, explaining about the stalking and my misplaced suspicions. To my surprise, Mike was incredibly understanding. He even offered to help me set up some extra security measures in my apartment. Gradually, I started to relax. Maybe it had all been in my head, stress and loneliness playing tricks on me. I threw myself back into work, started socializing more. Mike and I resumed our friendship, though there was an undercurrent of awkwardness now. One Friday night, Mike convinced me to join him and some friends for drinks at the Hawthorne. It felt good to be out, to laugh and joke without constantly looking over my shoulder. As the night wore on, I found myself opening up to Mike about everything: the divorce, my fears, how alone I'd felt in Boston. Mike listened attentively, his eyes never leaving mine. "You know," he said, leaning in close, "you're never alone when you have a true friend." Something in his tone made me pause. I looked down, and realized his hand was on my knee, gripped just a little too tight to be casual. That's when I saw it, peeking out from under his sleeve, a tattoo, the same distinctive design that had been on the wrist of the person in that old photo from Chicago, the one whose face had been scratched out. My blood turned to ice as the pieces started falling into place. The old photo, the intimate knowledge of my past, the way he'd always seemed to know where I was, what I was doing. It hadn't been paranoia, after all. Mike, or whatever his real name was, had been stalking me for years. I mumbled some excuse about needing air and bolted from the bar. My mind was racing, trying to process this horrifying revelation. How long had he been watching me? How much of my life had been orchestrated by this obsessed stranger? As I hurried down Com Ave, I heard footsteps behind me. "Wait up, buddy," Mike called, his voice still carrying that false note of friendliness. "You're not feeling well. Let me help you home." I broke into a run, heart pounding. I could hear him gaining on me. Just as his hand grasped my shoulder, I saw salvation. A green line train pulling into Copley Station. I sprinted down the stairs, squeezing through the closing doors just in time. As the train pulled away, I saw Mike on the platform, his face contorted with rage. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone to call Officer Ramirez. But before I could dial, a text came through. From Mike. "You can't run forever. It'll always find you. We belong together." The next few hours were a blur of police statements and frantic planning. Officer Ramirez and her team took my statement, cataloging every interaction, every coincidence that now seemed so sinister in hindsight. They promised to track Mike down, but I knew it wouldn't be that simple. He'd been playing this game for years. I couldn't go back to my apartment. It wasn't safe. The police set me up in a hotel under an assumed name, but I knew it was only a temporary solution. As I paced the small room, my mind raced through options. I could leave Boston, start over somewhere new. But he'd found me once already. What was to stop him from doing it again? In desperation, I reached out to an old college friend who worked in cybersecurity. Within hours, he'd helped me scrub my online presence, set up new accounts with ironclad privacy settings, even create a false digital trail leading to the West Coast. But as I sat in that sterile hotel room, jumping at every sound in the hallway, I knew it wasn't enough. I needed to disappear completely, to become someone Mike couldn't possibly recognize or track down. With shaking hands, I made a call to a contact my cybersecurity friend had reluctantly provided, a person who specialized in making people vanish. It would mean leaving everything behind, my job, my family, any hope of a normal life. But as another text from Mike lit up my phone, "I see you," I knew I had no choice. While I was planning my disappearance, the Boston PD was working overtime to track down Mike. Officer Ramirez kept me updated, her voice a mix of professional detachment and genuine concern. They discovered his real name, Eric Larson, and a history of stalking charges in 3 different states. The investigation uncovered a web of deception that made my skin crawl. Eric had been following me for years, always staying just out of sight. He'd engineered my job offer in Boston, set himself up as my neighbor, all part of an elaborate plan to finally insinuate himself into my life. As the police dug deeper, more victims came forward. Women from Chicago, from New York, from right here in Boston, all with similar stories of a charming neighbor who turned into a nightmare. The pattern was always the same. He'd pick a target, study them for months or even years, then make his move. Officer Ramirez assured me they were closing in on Eric. They'd found his real apartment, discovered his network of fake identities. It seemed like it was only a matter of time before they caught him. But as I listened to her confident words, a chill ran down my spine because I knew something the police didn't. The text he'd just received from a number I didn't recognize. Nice hotel. Room 412, right? Sweet dreams, my love. The police's raid on Eric's apartment yielded a treasure trove of evidence and a glimpse into the mind of a truly disturbed individual. Officer Ramirez's voice shook slightly as she described what they'd found. An entire room dedicated to me. Photos covering every inch of the walls, from recent snapshots to images from years ago. A timeline of my life, meticulously annotated with Eric's twisted observations. They found journals filled with rambling declarations of love and detailed plans for our future together. There were copies of my keys, receipts from restaurants I'd visited, even a lock of my hair. The level of obsession was staggering, but the most chilling discovery was a hidden room, accessible through a false back in a closet. Inside was a state-of-the-art surveillance setup. Monitors showed feeds from cameras planted not just in my apartment, but in my office, my favorite coffee shop, even my gym. Eric had been watching my every move for months. The police were confident that with this evidence, they could put Eric away for a long time. But there was one problem. Eric himself was nowhere to be found. The apartment had been cleared out, wiped clean of fingerprints. It was as if he'd known they were coming. As I absorbed this information, my phone buzzed with a new message. Unknown number. They'll never understand our love. It'll find you, no matter where you hide. I showed it to Officer Ramirez, watching the color drain from her face. The hunt wasn't over. It was just beginning. With Eric in the wind and clearly still fixated on me, the police moved me to a safe house on the outskirts of the city. It was a nondescript colonial in a quiet suburb, the kind of place where nothing ever happens. But as I paced the living room, watching officers patrol the perimeter, I knew the calm was an illusion. Officer Ramirez had become my lifeline, updating me regularly on the manhunt for Eric. They'd plastered his face across every news channel, set up roadblocks, and were monitoring all transportation hubs. But Eric was clever, always one step ahead. Days blurred together in a haze of fear and monotony. I jumped at every sound, convinced that somehow Eric had found me. The isolation was getting to me, but it was nothing compared to the constant dread of knowing he was out there, watching, waiting. Then came the breakthrough we'd been hoping for. A tip from a gas station attendant in New Hampshire. Eric had been spotted heading north. As Officer Ramirez relayed the news, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this nightmare was finally coming to an end. But that hope was short-lived, because just as she finished speaking, the lights in the safe house went out, plunging us into darkness. And from somewhere in the house came a sound that made my blood run cold, a familiar laugh, followed by 3 words. "I'm home, darling." In the pitch-black house, time seemed to stand still. I could hear the rapid breathing of the officer beside me, the creak of floorboards as someone, Eric, moved through the darkness. My mind raced, trying to remember the layout of the house, searching for an escape route. Suddenly, a hand grabbed my arm. I nearly screamed, but a voice whispered urgently in my ear, "Officer Ramirez." "Basement," she breathed. "Go, now." She pressed something cold and heavy into my hand, her service weapon. Heart pounding, I felt my way towards the basement door. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of a struggle, shouts, a muffled gunshot. Guilt warred with survival instinct as I slipped down the stairs, praying the creaking steps wouldn't give me away. The basement was a maze of old furniture and forgotten junk. I wedged myself behind a dusty wardrobe, gun clutched in trembling hands. Minutes passed like hours as I strained to hear any sound from above. Then, footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate. A flashlight beam swept the room. Come out, wherever you are," Eric's voice sing-songed. "Don't you see? This is our destiny. We're meant to be together." As the beam of light inched closer to my hiding spot, I made a split-second decision. I burst from behind the wardrobe, catching Eric off guard. We grappled in the darkness, the gun between us. A deafening bang echoed through the basement. For a moment, everything was still. Then Eric crumpled to the floor. As red and blue lights flooded through the basement windows, I sank to my knees, the nightmare finally over. The crisp September air in Pullman, Washington, filled me with excitement as I lugged my suitcases into my dorm room at Washington State University. The campus buzzed with energy, fellow freshmen and their families navigating the maze of buildings, upperclassmen reuniting with friends, and the distant cheers from football practice at Martin Stadium. My roommate, Sarah, had already arrived and was hanging fairy lights above her bed. We hit it off immediately, chatting about our hometowns and the classes we'd signed up for. That first week was a whirlwind of activities: orientation sessions, campus tours, and the bustling involvement fair on the Glen Terrell Mall. I signed up for the hiking club and the student newspaper, eager to make the most of my college experience. The dining hall became our social hub, where Sarah and I met other freshmen over plates of questionable pasta and endless soft-serve ice cream. As classes began, I found myself settling into a routine. My favorite spot became the Terrell Library, with its quiet study nooks and panoramic views of campus. Little did I know that this place of solace would soon become tainted by an unseen threat, lurking in the shadows of my new beginning. Psychology 101 quickly became my favorite class. Professor Hendricks had a way of making even the driest topics fascinating, and the lecture hall was always packed. It was during the third week when I first noticed him, a guy 2 rows ahead, always early, always prepared. His name was Ethan, I learned, when he answered a question about Freudian theories with such eloquence that even the professor seemed impressed. After class one day, Ethan approached me as I was packing up my laptop. "Hey, I'm Ethan," he said with a warm smile. "I couldn't help but notice your insights during the group discussion. Want to grab coffee and compare notes sometime?" Flattered and a bit flustered, I agreed. We met at the campus Starbucks the next day. and conversation flowed easily. Ethan was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts on everything from classical conditioning to my adjustment to college life. As we parted ways, he suggested we make it a regular study session. Over the next few weeks, our coffee meetups became a highlight of my routine. Ethan was always attentive, remembering little details about my life and offering thoughtful advice on navigating freshman year. I found myself looking forward to seeing him, both in class and during our study sessions. It felt like I had found a true friend, someone who understood me on a deeper level. Flattered and a bit flustered, I agreed. We met at the campus Starbucks the next day, and conversation flowed easily. Ethan was charming, intelligent, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts on everything from classical conditioning to my adjustment to college life. As we parted ways, he suggested we make it a regular study session. Over the next few weeks, our coffee meetups became a highlight of my routine. Ethan was always attentive, remembering little details about my life and offering thoughtful advice on navigating freshman year. I found myself looking forward to seeing him, both in class and during our study sessions. It felt like I had found a true friend, someone who understood me on a deeper level. The next day, I mentioned the encounter to Ethan during our psychology class. He looked confused, insisting he'd been in his dorm all night studying. "Maybe you saw someone who looks like me," he suggested with a laugh. I nodded, brushing it off, but something about his reaction felt off. Over the next week, I began noticing Ethan in unexpected places. Outside my dorm, when I left for early morning classes, in the cafeteria when I grabbed a late dinner, even at the gym during my usual workout time. Each time, he'd wave and strike up a conversation as if these encounters were completely normal. But the frequency started to make me uncomfortable. It started innocently enough. A text from Ethan asking about a psychology assignment at 11 p.m. I replied quickly and thought nothing of it. But soon, the late-night messages became more frequent and less about schoolwork. "What are you up to? I can't sleep. Want to chat?" I keep thinking about our conversation earlier. At first, I responded politely, but as the texts started coming in at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., even 3 a.m., I began to ignore them. That's when the calls started. I'd wake up to find 5 missed calls from Ethan, all between midnight and dawn. When I confronted him about it in person, he'd brush it off with a charming smile. "Sorry, I'm just a night owl." I'll try to remember the time difference. My body's still on East Coast time, but the messages and calls didn't stop. They became more insistent, more personal. "I saw you at the library today. That blue sweater looks great on you. Why aren't you answering? Are you with someone else?" The tone shifted from friendly to possessive, making my stomach churn with each notification. One night, after a particularly persistent string of messages, I turned off my phone completely. The next morning, I woke up to 37 missed calls and a voicemail that made my blood run cold. Ethan's voice, usually so smooth and confident, sounded frantic and angry. "Why are you ignoring me? Don't you understand how special our connection is? I need to talk to you, now." The library had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in studies and forget at about the growing unease in my daily life. But lately, even this safe haven felt tainted. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of eyes boring into the back of my head as I hunched over my textbooks. One afternoon, I was deep into a research paper when I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned around, scanning the rows of bookshelves behind me. For a split second, I thought I saw a flash of movement, a shadow ducking behind a shelf. My heart racing, I gathered my things and moved to a more open area near the reference desk. As I tried to refocus on my work, a librarian approached. "Excuse me," she said softly, "but I thought you should know. A young man was asking about you earlier, wanted to know your usual study spots. I didn't tell him anything, of course, but I thought it was odd." My mouth went dry. "What did he look like?" I asked, already knowing the answer. As she described Ethan, my fears were confirmed. He was looking for me, tracking my movements even here. I thanked her, my mind reeling. As I packed up to leave, I couldn't help but scan every face, every shadow. The library, once a place of comfort, now felt like a maze of potential hiding spots for someone who didn't want to be seen. I fumbled with my keycard, eager to collapse onto my bed after a long day of classes. As the door swung open, I froze. There, on my perfectly made bed, lay a bouquet of red roses. My roommate Sarah was out for the weekend, so it couldn't have been her doing. With shaking hands, I approached the flowers, my heart pounding. A small card nestled among the blooms caught my eye. "To my soulmate, I'm always watching over you." The handwriting was unmistakably Ethan's. But how had he gotten into my room? I checked the windows, all locked. The door showed no signs of forced entry. A wave of nausea hit me as I realized he must have somehow obtained a key card. Panicked, I called campus security. They arrived quickly, took my statement, and confiscated the flowers as evidence. But their words provided little comfort. "Well, look into it, but without concrete proof of who left these, there's not much we can do. Maybe it's just a secret admirer." That night, I pushed my desk chair against the door and barely slept. Every creak, every shadow made me jolt awake. The roses were gone, but their sickly sweet scent seemed to linger, a constant reminder that my private space had been violated. My dorm room, once a cozy retreat, now felt like a trap. I couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was out there, watching, waiting for his next opportunity to get close to me. The invasion of my dorm room was the tipping point. Paranoia seeped into every aspect of my life, coloring my daily routines with a constant undercurrent of fear. I began to see Ethan's face in every crowd, his shadow in every corner. Sleep became a luxury, replaced by long nights of staring at the ceiling, jumping at every sound. I changed my routes to classes, taking longer, more convoluted paths to avoid predictability. My usual spots in the cafeteria and library were abandoned for new, less exposed locations. I even switched up my laundry schedule, doing loads at odd hours when the basement was likely to be empty. My phone became both a lifeline and a source of dread. I installed multiple security apps, constantly checking for any signs of hacking or tracking. Every unknown number, every social media request sent my heart racing. Was it him? Had he found a new way to reach me? Even my appearance didn't escape the paranoia. I stopped wearing the clothes Ethan had complimented, opting for nondescript outfits that wouldn't stand out. My long hair, which he once called beautiful, was cut short and dyed a different color. Friends noticed the change, of course. "You seem on edge," they'd say, concern in their eyes. But how could I explain the constant fear, the feeling of being hunted on what should have been a safe campus? I withdrew, making excuses to avoid social gatherings. Isolation felt safer, but with each passing day, I felt more trapped in a prison of my own making. The crisp autumn air did little to calm my nerves as I hurried across the campus quad. My eyes darted from face to face, a habit I couldn't shake. That's when I saw him, Ethan, standing near the fountain, staring directly at me. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, and he was gone, like a mirage. But it wasn't the last time. He appeared everywhere, a glimpse in the reflection of a store window, a figure ducking into a doorway as I passed, a hooded shape following me at a distance. Each sighting sent my heart racing, even though I was never quite sure if it was really him or just my imagination running wild. During a packed lecture, I could have sworn I saw Ethan sitting at the back, his eyes never leaving me. But when I gathered the courage to look again, a different student occupied the seat. At the campus coffee shop, I heard his laugh, distinct and chilling, only to turn and find no sign of him. The constant vigilance was exhausting. I found myself second-guessing every interaction, wondering if the person I was talking to was somehow connected to Ethan. Had he recruited others to watch me? Was I just being paranoid? One evening, while studying in the library, I felt the familiar sensation of being watched. I looked up to see Ethan standing at the end of my row, smiling. This time, I was sure it was him. I blinked, and he remained, his presence undeniable. As I scrambled to gather my things, he disappeared into the stacks. I ran out of the library, my safe haven now forever tainted. The campus cafeteria buzzed with the usual lunchtime crowd, a cacophony of voices and clattering trays. I sat with my back to the wall, a habit I developed over the past weeks. Midway through my meal, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked up to see Ethan striding purposefully towards me, his face a mask of determination. "Why are you avoiding me?" he demanded, loud enough for nearby tables to turn and stare. "We have something special. You can't just ignore it." I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and fear. "Ethan, please," I whispered. "I've told you, I'm not interested. You need to leave me alone." His eyes flashed dangerously. "Leave you alone? After everything we've shared? I know you better than anyone. I've been watching you, protecting you." The word "watching" sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, trying to create distance between us. "That's exactly the problem, Ethan. You're stalking me. It needs to stop." He reached out, grabbing my arm. "You don't mean that. You're confused. Let me explain." "Let go of her!" a voice boomed. My friend Mike from the hiking club had appeared, along with several other students. Ethan's grip loosened, and I pulled away. "This isn't over," Ethan hissed, before storming off. As concerned friends surrounded me, I felt a mix of relief and dread. The confrontation had been public, witnessed by dozens, but Ethan's parting words echoed in my mind, a promise that my nightmare was far from over. With shaking hands, I pushed open the door to the campus security office. After the cafeteria incident, I knew I couldn't handle this alone anymore. Officer Jenkins, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, listened patiently as I poured out my story. The gifts, the messages, the constant feeling of being watched. "I'm sorry you're going through this," she said, her brow furrowed with concern. "But I have to ask, do you have any concrete evidence? Text messages, emails, witnesses to specific threats?" My heart sank. I had deleted most of Ethan's messages in a panic, and the calls were from blocked numbers. The flowers in my room? No cameras in the dorm hallways to prove it was him. The cafeteria confrontation? Witnesses, yes, but no explicit threats were made. "Well, increase patrols around your dorm," Officer Jenkins assured me. "But without clear evidence of a crime, our hands are somewhat tied. Have you considered talking to the campus counselor?" I left the office feeling deflated. They'd taken my statement, promised to keep an eye out, but I could sense their skepticism. Was I overreacting? No, I told myself firmly. The fear I felt was real. Next stop was the Dean of Students' office. Surely they could do something. Switch my classes, maybe even remove Ethan from campus. But I was met with more sympathetic nods and vague promises to look into it. As I walked back to my dorm, I felt more alone than ever. The system designed to protect me seemed woefully unprepared for the subtle terror of stalking. I realized with a sinking feeling that if I wanted to feel safe again, I might have to take matters into my own hands. I knew something was wrong the moment I turned the corner to my dorm room. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible in the gap. My heart pounded as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I had to know. Pushing the door open, I fumbled for the light switch. As the room illuminated, I gasped. It looked like a tornado had torn through the space. My belongings were strewn everywhere, clothes ripped from hangers, books scattered across the floor, my laptop open on the bed. But it wasn't just chaos. There was a terrifying method to the madness. Photos of me, some I recognized, others clearly taken without my knowledge, were pinned to every surface. Candid shots of me studying in the library, jogging on campus, even sleeping in my bed. Scrawled across my mirror in what looked horribly like red lipstick were the words, "You are mine." My knees buckled, and I sank to the floor, overwhelmed by violation and fear. This wasn't just an invasion of my room. It was an assault on my very sense of safety and self. Through my panic, one thought crystallized. I couldn't stay here. This room, this campus, had become a hunting ground, and I was the prey. With trembling hands, I called campus security. As I waited for them to arrive, I huddled in the hallway, unable to bear the sight of my desecrated space. The place that had once been my refuge had become a nightmare, and I knew that no amount of cleaning or rearranging could erase the memory of this violation. Word of the break-in spread quickly through my dorm and friend group. At first, there was an outpouring of sympathy and support. Sarah, my roommate, was horrified and insisted on staying with a friend for a few nights to give me space. But as days passed and campus life tried to return to normal, I sensed a shift in attitudes. "Are you sure it was Ethan?" Sarah asked hesitantly one evening. "I mean, he's always seemed so nice. Maybe it was just a random creep." My friend Mike, who had stood up for me in the cafeteria, started to express doubts. "Look, I'm not saying you're making it up, but are you sure you're not reading too much into things? Ethan hasn't been in any of our study groups lately. Maybe he's backed off." Even my parents, initially supportive, began to sound skeptical during our phone calls. "Honey, college is stressful. Are you sure this isn't anxiety manifesting in an unhealthy way?" my mom suggested gently. Their doubts felt like betrayal. I started to withdraw, spending more time alone in my room, despite the lingering unease I felt there. The isolation only fueled my fears, but I couldn't bear to see the looks of concern mixed with disbelief on my friends' faces. I began to question myself. Was I overreacting? Was this all in my head? But then it'd catch a glimpse of a familiar silhouette across the quad or receive a hang-up call from an unknown number, and the terror would come rushing back. I knew in my gut that the danger was real, even if no one else believed me. It was a crisp autumn evening. The campus bathed in the golden light of sunset. I was hurrying back to my dorm after a late study session, my mind preoccupied with an upcoming midterm. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, too close, too fast. I glanced back and my blood ran cold. Ethan was there, barely 20 feet behind me, his face a mask of determination. Panic surged through me. I broke into a run, my backpack thumping against my spine as I sprinted across the quad. I could hear Ethan's footsteps quickening, matching my pace. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, darting between groups of students who turned to stare at the commotion. I headed for the student center, praying it would still be open. Just as I reached the steps, I felt a hand grasp at my jacket. With a cry, I wrenched myself free, losing my balance and tumbling onto the concrete. Pain shot through my palms and knees, but adrenaline kept me moving. Scrambling to my feet, I burst through the doors of the student center. "Help!" I screamed, my voice echoing in the nearly empty lobby. The security guard at the desk jumped up, startled by my sudden entrance. Behind me, I heard the doors slam open again. "Stop that man!" I yelled, pointing at Ethan, who had frozen in the doorway. The guard moved towards him, but Ethan was already turning, sprinting back into the darkness of the quad. As the guard called for backup, I collapsed onto a nearby chair, shaking uncontrollably. The chase was over, but the terror remained. I knew this was just another escalation in Ethan's dangerous obsession. The old bell tower had always been off limits to students, its heavy wooden door usually locked tight. But tonight, as I fled from Ethan's relentless pursuit, I found it ajar, a potential sanctuary or a trap. With no time to weigh my options, I slipped inside and began to climb the narrow, winding stairs. My legs burned as I ascended, the sound of my ragged breathing echoing off the stone walls. Behind me, I could hear Ethan's footsteps, steady and determined. "You can't run forever," his voice called out, sending chills down my spine. I reached the top, a small circular room with large arched windows offering a panoramic view of the darkened campus below. The massive bell hung ominously above, silent for decades. There was nowhere left to run. Ethan appeared at the top of the stairs, his face flushed and eyes wild. Finally, he panted, "We're alone. No one to interrupt us." "Ethan, please," I begged, backing away until I felt the cold stone wall behind me. "This has to stop. You're scaring me." He moved closer, his expression softening into something almost tender. "I'm doing this because I love you. Can't you see that? We're meant to be together." As he reached for me, I ducked under his arm, making a desperate dash for the stairs. But Ethan was quicker, grabbing my wrist and pulling me back. We grappled, teetering dangerously close to the window's edge. The ground below seemed to spin, vertigo threatening to overwhelm me. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I brought my knee up hard, catching Ethan in the stomach. He doubled over, loosening his grip. With all my strength, I pushed him away and bolted for the stairs. As I descended, I could hear him calling my name, his voice a mixture of pain and rage. The weeks following the bell tower incident passed in a blur of police statements, counseling sessions, and sleepless nights. Ethan was arrested, charged with stalking and attempted assault. The evidence from the break-in, combined with witness accounts from the quad chase and the bell tower, was finally enough for decisive action. As Ethan faced legal consequences, I grappled with the aftermath of the trauma. Nightmares plagued my sleep, and I jumped at every unexpected sound. But slowly, with the support of a trauma-informed therapist and a survivor support group, I began to heal. The university implemented new security measures, including better lighting across campus and an improved emergency response system. My story, shared anonymously, became a catalyst for increased awareness about stalking and the need for better protection of students.